right now we're not providing people with any choices. If people wanted to live in a clustered environment, again, maybe because they're aging and they want more neighbors, they don't want to walk as much. We're actually telling those people through our land use laws, you can't. We're not even giving them the option. We don't do that with a one size fits all zoning that we see across the country, which is the large lot, single family only, no mixed use, car dependent type of development. And so I like to call that the one size fits all zoning, because that's what we see in community and community after community across the country.
Welcome to Housing Matters, the podcast that covers everything real estate, from buying your first home to building your investment portfolio, hosted by me, Matt Pouliot of Pouliot Real Estate. Each episode brings expert insights, smart strategies, and real talk on housing and affordability. If it's about real estate, it matters here. And today we are thrilled to have joining us Sara Bronin. She's a George Washington University law professor, the founder and CEO of the Land Use Atlas, and author of Key to the City: How Zoning Shapes Our World. Sara has spent her career educating others about the land use rules that affect our economy, society, health, and happiness. She created the Connecticut Zoning Atlas in 2020 as part of a pro-homes coalition-driven campaign that resulted in successful statewide zoning reform. Since then, she has built Land Use Atlas, Inc., which oversees the National Preservation Atlas, into a thriving organization that influences policy, supports research, and boosts advocacy. The author of Key to the City: How Zoning Shapes Our World, and co-author of 4 other books on land use and historic preservation law, Bronin is an architect and attorney who holds a named professorship at George Washington University Law School. So today, Sara, I want to get started by talking about zoning, kind of like Zoning 101, what it is and why it matters. A lot of people, I think, hear about zoning, but they don't fully understand what it is. Can you walk us through that, kind of the history of how it began, how it works at a basic level, and why it plays such a central role in shaping towns and cities?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks so much for having me, Matt. It's nice to beam in, and I hope your readers find this conversation about zoning possibly a very boring topic to many, somewhat interesting. Zoning to me is endlessly fascinating. It happens at the local level. It's really local regulation of land uses, of the buildings and structures that we put on land, and of the lots and how lots are developed themselves. So it really does, through these very arcane rules from one jurisdiction to the next, have a pretty big influence on what can be built. And what can be built in our communities, of course, influences in turn our economy. It influences how we connect with each other. It influences what our impact is on the environment. So I think these local land use rules have been overlooked by a lot of people. And again, it seems like, oh, what zoning? It's 200-page zoning code. And that's what we actually see, almost 200-page zoning codes across the country on average at the National Zoning Atlas. Who wants to read through that? Yes, it's very arcane, but it's extremely consequential. So I look at zoning and I think more people have got to know about this hidden power.
Mm-hmm. So how was it that how zoning came to be? It's my understanding that some of this first was in New York City a little over 100 years ago. And then there was, I think, a case in which there was a development company in Ohio, Euclid, Ohio, that, if I remember correctly, wanted to develop some industrial land. And that then went all the way to the Supreme Court because they were told by the local municipality, which had set up a zoning ordinance to say you can't have industrial in this area. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court sided with the local municipality, which it seems set some precedent. Is this tracking correctly?
Absolutely. You've nailed it. You're talking about the Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty case, the 1926 Supreme Court case celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. I'm about to go to a conference that is about the Euclid case and its 100th anniversary. Wow. And I think it's going to be pretty interesting. But that case really solidified the prospect or the possibility of local governments engaging in land use regulation. And just like you said, zoning emerged in larger cities, New York, and And then you saw Chicago, LA, lots of smaller communities around the country in the early 20th century look around and say, actually, maybe we shouldn't be putting housing next to this factory. Maybe we should be separating out uses from each other. Some people thought zoning would be good for, let's say, good for small town main streets, good for business. Other people had more nefarious rationales for zoning, segregating different types of people. And we can talk about
Mm.
that more
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
if you want to get into that. But I mean, in general, this motivation to order land use in communities started happening early 20th century. The New York City zoning resolution was in 1916. And then once the Supreme Court said, we're testing out whether a jurisdiction can do this, whether it's within their police power in 1926, they said, you know what? Yeah, it is. And then after that, you really saw a wave of adoption of zoning across the country. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that the federal government played a big role in zoning because they put out these model rules for state legislatures to adopt called zoning enabling acts. And once the states adopted these zoning enabling acts, it basically gave even clearer permission to local governments that they could regulate land use. So you have
Hmm.
a federal dynamic, a state dynamic, and then local governments experimenting with different options.
Yeah, and now it seems that well, like an example in Maine, we're very local control focused at the municipal level as opposed to at the county level. And we have a lot of cases here in which there are local ordinances that go into place related to zoning that really prohibit things from moving forward. As an example, Maine was really forward thinking in passing a law at the state level, which I was co-sponsor of, that allowed for people to have accessory dwelling units essentially on every single lot. But then at the local level, it kind of didn't go far enough because at the local level, the municipality could say, well, you need to have X amount of setback, or you need to have a certain amount of parking spaces, or whatever. So they could still have this mechanism at the local level to prohibit the additional units being added to that site. And that seems to be not unique to us. It seems to be something that happens nationally. And I'm kind of wondering, from your experience and looking at zoning across the country, what are the main themes that kind of emerge, and what do you hope people kind of take away when they're reading things like your book, Key to the City? Are there things that they can really affect change with?
Yeah, so there's a lot in your question. I'm going to start actually with Maine because you mentioned the difficulty in getting maybe a statewide concept, a policy adopted and implemented at the local level, and the kinds of things that it sounds like you saw in Maine in response to a well-intentioned law, pro housing, putting in on single-family lots a smaller unit, maybe for a family member or a essential worker or a person who may want to age in place in their community needs a different option. Accessory dwellings or ADUs, as I think they're more commonly known as today, are a really good option. And so the state law was a good idea, but at the local level, Maine has 496 jurisdictions. What that may have zoning authority. They have the authority to adopt zoning. We've worked in Maine to analyze the Portland metro area and actually Washington County, which, again, as your listeners probably know, is in the very northern coast. On the coast, it's the northernmost county on the coast.
Mhm.
Just looking at those two areas, we certainly saw a huge variety in Maine, and we saw something that thought was really unexpected, which is very, very long zoning codes and a high number of zoning districts in every code. So a zoning code is written, it assigns it to a residential district, assigns land to a commercial district. And there's just like a really high level of regulatory complexity in Maine. And so when you layer that on top of a state coming back around and saying, all right, we told you, I don't know when the Maine Zoning Enabling Act was passed, but let's call it decades ago. Decades ago, do what you want on land use. Now we're going to come back around to layer in new rules so that we can, as a state, move forward on housing in
Mhm.
the case of the ADUs. It becomes really difficult. And because zoning is so complex, you mentioned setbacks, minimum lot sizes, there's lot coverage requirements, parking requirements. there's so many different little tools that locals can use, um, it both good and bad, to shape land use. And I think, what I would say about our project, the National Zoning Atlas, and what I tried to do in the book is to kind of expose that type of regulatory complexity and to say, again, maybe it was well intentioned from the start. Maybe, the 490, actually 497, I think now, that sometimes the boundaries are updated. So we've got to add that last one in our update. But the hundreds of jurisdictions in Maine that have authority to zone, they pass these codes, and maybe they didn't even realize what that complexity was doing to the communities. And housing is a great example. And so across the book, across the zoning atlas, I just really want people to understand how all of these levers work together and how they have real life outcomes, real world outcomes. In the case of housing, zoning across the country is so restrictive that people can't find homes. There's a chronic housing shortage in all kinds of communities, big cities, small towns, rural areas. And zoning is an important part of that. And that's what I have tried to expose across both of those projects.
So, Sara, you helped create the Connecticut Zoning Atlas and now lead the broader Zoning Atlas effort nationally. Can you explain what this is? What is the Zoning Atlas, and specifically, how it works? I know you just mentioned a little bit about the experience in Maine, but what's your vision for this nationally beyond the awareness piece? What do you hope happens with it next?
Well, we built the original zoning atlas in Connecticut to actually make change at the state level to help support the passage of reform legislation to the State Zoning Enabling Act that would enable more housing to be built in Connecticut. The coalition that helped to power the zoning atlas and then brought the data to legislators was successful in making change then, and even in the last legislative session, we saw another pretty big statewide reform bill. So I think for me personally, the motivation has been to improve the land use rules as we know them today. We've also seen, though, that the zoning atlas, which painstakingly maps all of these zoning districts across the country and across every state in New England, and Maine is the only one that is not totally pushed onto the map, is not totally published onto the map. But 6 states in the West, including California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, 15 states total actually up on the map. What we're trying to do, in addition to my personal interest in reforms, is really just present the foundation for research and understanding about how we use land. For example, we see a lot of land out west that is not zoned, and not only because it's federal land or protected lands, but also because I think communities have just decided not to zone. We thought, for example, we'd see a lot of that in Maine, a lot of unzoned territory. And in fact, the opposite is true. We've seen a lot of zoning in Maine, again, more than we would have expected. So what we're doing with this atlas on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, we're about 28% of the country complete in terms of the number of jurisdictions, and the total is 33,000 local governments and local entities that may have zoning. So give us some time. We're at 9,200 or so, but it's a slog through zoning codes. And just to give you a sense of the stats, so far we've read over 1 million pages of zoning codes, and we've logged 100,000 zoning districts. And that means somebody on our team is drawing where the districts are, and then somebody else on our team is saying what can be allowed in those districts. So if you go to the map, and it's at zoningatlas.org, you can see where is single family housing allowed, where is multifamily housing allowed, what are the minimum lot sizes associated with it. So we know the tool has been used by real estate agents, by policymakers, by planners, and by people who want to compare how their town is doing to the town next door.
So you had mentioned that Maine has quite a zoning maze. I think a lot of that probably has to do with the number of municipalities that we have. Is this like an East Coast phenomenon, or are there other states more mid or west that have this? I would assume California is probably a bit of a zoo.
Maine and California are really neck and neck in terms of complexity. So that gives you a sense, because we had the same project manager in Maine as in California. And she's based in California. She said, in some ways, Maine is even more complicated. So you're
Interesting.
absolutely right that California is up there in terms of regulatory complexity. Interestingly, we are seeing things like Massachusetts and Connecticut, which have uh, almost their land fully zoned. Same for Rhode Island, it's fully zoned. But we see actually not so long zoning codes in Massachusetts as we do, for example, in Maine. In New Hampshire, again, just speaking in adjacent or nearby communities to and states to Maine, you also see not only less zoning overall in terms of which communities have even exercised zoning, but you also see shorter codes, fewer districts. It's much more maybe libertarian in bent in Hampshire, different in Vermont. So it's really, and it's interesting to see those differences between the states, and not necessarily always what we expect.
So, are you finding that states that are more, having spent 12 years in politics and now in recovery, I know that many things are political. And so I'm wondering if there's any correlation between Democrat leaning or more progressive states with more strict zoning ordinances as compared to like conservative, maybe more, Republican leaning states.
That's a great question. So I should maybe disclose that I am from Houston, Texas, which is the only
Has no
large,
zoning.
it's the only large American city that doesn't have zoning. And the city is well north of 500 square miles, just as a single city. It keeps annexing land, and it's a
Mm.
very hungry city. But it is a place where they don't even bother with zoning. I would probably venture to guess we haven't fully completed the state of Texas in our analysis because it has so many jurisdictions. But I would venture to guess that the codes there are, on the whole, when we finally finish it, we've done all the big metro areas, including Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Austin. But when we finally finish the whole state, we'll probably find a state with zoning codes that are much slimmer than, say, a California, certainly.
Mhm.
But I don't know that it necessarily falls along party lines, because I would view, again, Maine, for example, as a state which is a live and let live, pro property rights type of state. I would have predicted, I would have put good money on simplicity, short codes, clear requirements, just from the politics that I understand as an outsider, to maybe be more prevalent in Maine than in, say, a Connecticut, which is more left leaning, and you might think has more regulation, but it didn't work out that way. I think when we finish even a few more states, it would be very interesting to see. I mean, if you go to the map, you can also look at Arizona versus New Mexico,
Mm.
potentially states with somewhat similar politics, maybe. Certainly Arizona, a more purple state sometimes, but totally different approaches to zoning. Arizona is 106 jurisdictions, 104 are zoned, whereas New Mexico, there's a large number of jurisdictions that don't have zoning. And again, they're side by side, potentially more similar than other places, almost like a Connecticut, Massachusetts, maybe kind of pairing, but in the
Mm.
Southwest. And you see big differences in zoning. I don't know how we explain that.
Yeah, interesting. I kind of have this theory, and I'm curious what you think about it, that we have a phenomenon occurring in the United States now where we came out of the New Deal with a lot of different programs and also things that allowed people to get a job and buy a home. And that was like the culmination of them trading their time for money was that they had a home that they could raise their family in and be in. And then in time, we have created more programs that have allowed people to be supported outside of homeownership. And so there has been this desire among the people who had the homeownership or who have homeownership to protect that at the cost of the ability for more entrants to come in to the market. And we've seen this like just at a micro level in Maine in a municipality like Cape Elizabeth, for instance, where people would come and testify and say, hey, look, I grew up in Cape Elizabeth. I was hoping to go back there to raise my family, but I can't because the economics of actually building a modestly sized single family home there are like, I can't find any land to do that on because it's been priced out in the way that it's been squeezed from a zoning and use perspective to create scarcity and then therefore drive up the pricing to a level that people can't afford. And I'm just kind of wondering, a lot of times to me, zoning is a little bit of like the boogeyman. There are other factors at stake here, but we at least need to have a base level knowledge of what's allowed where to start building awareness and a conversation around what we can do to hopefully improve it. It's like if we're all running around in a room with the lights off trying to find the door, then it's going to be hard to find the door. So the zoning atlas helps shine a light on what's going on. But I'm wondering then what we do from a policy perspective, if anything, as maybe a country or states, to try to actually change things in a way that would be meaningful other than just saying, you can put a duplex here instead of a single family. I'm curious. I know there was a lot there, but I'm curious what you think about all that.
Yeah. So for sure, one of the big benefits of having information like the zoning atlas available to policymakers is so that they can see what is now. When we finished the Portland metro area, we did a webinar on it. So again, any of your listeners can see that online in our website. It's on the resources page. And I think some of the attendees were pretty surprised to find that the way that local jurisdictions were regulating for accessory dwelling units was actually contrary to what the state law said. Maybe the local jurisdictions thought, well, the state law overrides, we don't need to change our own zoning, but we log what the local conditions say. So if somebody's at the counter and somebody comes in with an ADU permit, they're going to look at their own zoning regulations 9 times out of 10, I would think. So it just exposing a disconnect like that can help policymakers understand that, maybe there's some updates that can be made to that ADU bill that you passed that would close loopholes, make sure that it's part of the local legislation, make sure that things like additional parking requirements for the ADU or minimum lot size requirements are not undermining the intent of that law. And I think they can do that with the fine-grained information that we provide them in the zoning atlas. We would love to get the rest of the state done. We're looking for funding for that because it's a nonprofit. We just go where we can find additional funds. But I think you'll see across the state very similar conditions to what we saw in Washington County. But I think your larger question was really where do we go? What are the opportunities? I think, and the map is really a tool to just show what is, and for others to say what the opportunities are. If it were up to me, for example, at this conference that I'm talking,
yes, I'm asking if Sara were to wave a magic wand, what would happen?
For example, I will present a paper that at this conference that will identify some opportunities for state zoning enabling acts to either change the way that they require local governments to do certain things. In fact, to loosen or require local governments to loosen certain constraints, particularly on housing, but also encourage for us to rethink how we set up the zoning regime in the first place. It is a crazy thing to think that the regulation of one of America's most important resources at a national level is taking place in up to 33,000 different local community meetings
crazy.
At a time.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's
whether
crazy.
Whether that's good policy for us as a nation, even within individual states, I think is debatable. And our atlas is showing how the differences play out on a state-by-state basis.
I mean, it's been really eye-opening for me because, when we start talking about different like human needs, housing is universal. It doesn't matter. It doesn't see politics or your age or anything like that. It's just a roof over your head. And it's a basic human need that we all have. And so, I mean, I'm a Republican, conservative, smaller government kind of guy, but as it relates to housing, oftentimes I was out on a limb because I was at odds with my caucus who was saying, look, we have to basically support local control. We need to make sure that, we're not usurping the local municipalities. And it's like, guys, every one of your constituents needs a place to live. And right now in our state alone, we're 80,000 short. Nationally, some 4 to 5 million, and the numbers are always all over the place. Let's just all say it's bad everywhere. And we need more, right? And the only way to do that is to loosen up regulations. And the last time I checked, we were the crew that wanted less regulations. So what is with the disconnect here? And I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that people, just human nature, don't like to be told what to do, number one. And number two, we need to feel secure, right? And so if you've put all your eggs in this basket of this one home, and then for some reason in your mind, you believe that if somebody builds a duplex next door, your property value is going to tank, then naturally you're like, geez, I need to protect this, right? And it's being done at the expense of other people. As it relates to housing, nationally, Japan has like one zone. Like what you want to do, just supplies everywhere, right? In the United States, 33,000 different jurisdictions with their own different zones, which just compounds on that. I mean, gosh, it must be over 1 million different zones. Do you have any idea how many it is?
Well, we're at 100,000, having reviewed 28% of the jurisdictions.
So let's say it's 500,000.
Maybe it's 300 to 500,000 total zoning districts.
Yeah.
But who can keep track? A residential district in one jurisdiction is different from a residential district in another jurisdiction. You say mixed use in one place, and that might be industrial and adult uses. You say mixed use in another place, and that might be what you might think of as a typical downtown. So there's no rhyme or reason to those hundreds of thousands of zoning districts that will be likely to find. And it's a big challenge for all of us. I think you're right too about this notion that people feel like the zoning power is a power that should be kept at the local level, in part because of a status quo bias. They think, well, this has to be the way it's done. We have to have local people opining on each and every application, and we have to allow for people to come in and yell at decision makers for making decisions, especially the pro-housing decisions and the public hearings. And if you've been to any public hearing on zoning, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That is not the level of yelling that you might get from neighbors is like not a great way to make policy. Looking at the numbers, seeing the housing shortage, you mentioned 80,000 in Maine. Again, communities all over the country are seeing this. Looking at the environmental costs, Maine has very, very large lot size requirements. So what does that mean? If you have to have an acre to build a home, you're building out into the environmentally protected areas that people in Maine move to Maine to enjoy. So the land use policies are undermining, I would say, in Maine and in other places, a statewide ethic. I mean, you look at Colorado. Colorado has huge minimum lot sizes. I think of Colorado as the environmentalist state, but the land use policy says something totally different. And so you see deforestation, environmental degradation, water pollution issues in that state, probably similar in Maine where there is growth happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the initial idea might be in Colorado, hey, let's make the lot sizes bigger, make it less economically viable for people to build roads and develop it, and still it happens. And then they end up taking up more land than they would have if there was more of an effort with the zoning to have cluster developments or tighter lot sizes so that we can have more open space left afterwards.
And the way I look at it is right now, we're not providing people with any choices. If people wanted to live in a clustered environment, again, maybe because they're aging and they want more neighbors, they don't want to walk as much. We're actually telling those people through our land use laws, you can't. We're not even giving them the option. And I'm really big on providing people with options. We don't do that with a one-size-fits-all zoning that we see across the country, which is the large lot, single family only, no mixed use, car dependent type of development. And so I like to call that the one size fits all zoning, because that's what we see in community after community across the country.
So I have some initially what I was drawn to your effort by was a group that I'm a part of is called the Housing Innovation Alliance, and they're really focused on ways to increase innovation in housing creation. And how to do that is multiple things. One of them is offsite construction, which has only represented 5% of new home starts in the United States are properties that are built not on the site, actually. And in order to have offsite construction be effective, you need to have a certain continuity, a pipeline to kind of keep the thing going, and a little bit of certainty of what's allowed where. And so I began thinking, well, in order for us to do that, in again, Japan would be super easy, right? Or maybe some Scandinavian countries. But in the United States, not so much, because you might design the home with this kind of a, snow load. And these kind of gets into codes more than zoning a little bit as well. But understanding even where things can go is a detriment to people who are trying to make that decision as a consumer. Where could I put one of these if I wanted to? And I began thinking, maybe if we had a tool in which a consumer could open up this app and look around at different sites of where they could put a home, and they were like, oh, this is vacant, and it's zoned for single family homes. Great. Let's just put the house on there and see like how much it would cost to do it there. Like this consumer forward application that people could use to explore new construction, not using a traditional general contractor site built approach, but instead more of this Carvana of homes approach, where you order your home from an offsite builder. It gets delivered to the site. Obviously, it needs to be installed and so forth. But you were able to determine from a desktop essentially where that could go. And one easier way to do that would just be to say at a national level, single family homes are allowed everywhere. That would be, great in my opinion. But it's not likely to happen anytime soon. And so short of that, this to me was the piece of the puzzle that was missing in order for us to see at a higher level, okay, where is it allowed and where is it not? Because even if you go into, and not to get too into the weeds for people listening that may not be familiar, but there is a system called GIS in which there's tons of information, government information that's piled in, and there's so many layers like wetlands and all this kind of stuff. But it only ever has an overlay for what the zone is. It doesn't go to the next level, like what you're proposing to do, to say, hey, like, well, what actually can you do in a PD zone in Augusta, Maine? Okay. And because just seeing that it's planned development doesn't mean anything. Then you got to go to this analog book or to a website and scroll down to page 37 to see that if you have a lot size of 20,000 square feet with 200 feet of road frontage, you could build a house. Well, that whole exercise just took too long. I'm wondering if there is an effort to put what you're collecting for data into like a GIS type system, or another application in which people could make some more decisions relative to that placement of housing.
So here I am on the National Zoning Atlas site on the border between New Hampshire and Maine. And
Okay.
one of the things that you can do here is this filter called Show Me Where People Can Build. And if I
Wow.
click single family housing, you can see
Mhm.
you can build the map is still purple. So the light purple is primarily residential, not mixed use. The deep purple is mixed use, residential, and something else. And then this light peach that disappeared when I click that is non-residential. So here you have an airport industrial use. So you saw lots of single family housing already allowed. And then just to click on this, where can I build an apartment?
Hmm.
This is where you can build an apartment by right in this. Again, here we are in,
Yikes.
you point out there's all kinds of.
It's not nearly as many places, for those who are not able to see it, not nearly as many places as what was showing with the single family homes.
So you can see just from this map, that's exactly why we built this map, is so that people can see. If you look at accessory dwellings too, you can see actually pretty permissive in this part of the state. And as I zoom up, you see entire jurisdictions that actually don't allow ADUs by right on single family land. So these white jurisdictions, as you get closer to, as you go northward to Portland, Limerick out here, Hollis. But you see within Portland, a lot of single family, a lot of accessory dwelling units. Now, just clicking on the apartment filter here, as predicted, you would predict Portland allows a lot of apartments, and indeed it does across virtually the whole city. But as you get further out, you see a lot less allowance for that. So our tool really is set up to help people ask those questions, and you can look at the advanced filters for minimum lot size and all of that. But that's
That's
just a
great.
quick little snapshot. We haven't built it for, I would say, the common user. You have to know a little bit about what you're looking for and that you know what zoning is. You maybe look at the legend and layers and see what the zoning layers say. But once you get the hang of that, and we do have a tips page so you can do a tutorial. Once you get the hang of that, you can actually do exactly what you're saying on our map, integrating that with other
Can you
resources.
put a tab on the side that says warehousing is legal and warehousing is illegal? Because I feel like people would get that, right? And we're just starting to see people wake up to this phenomenon, at least I think just nationally. Like you said, you're going to a conference, it's the 100-year anniversary, and now we have a crisis upon us that was created by other factors. It was created by economic factors such as low rates that then went high very quickly, changes in the labor market, aging demographics, a lot of in-migration, a lot of things created this housing crisis, not just zoning. And now people are aware, like, hey, we have a crisis around housing. What can we look to? I think a lot of people are waking up to zoning as a part of it. Some people seem to think it's like the biggest piece of the puzzle. I think that it is a very key piece of the puzzle, yet it's not the whole picture. I mean, we need workforce, we need availability of materials, money to pay for it, all this kind of stuff. But a lot of this stuff, like you started out saying, hey, zoning's boring. I don't think it's boring because I understand the implications that it has. But as a 22-year-old on the planning board, when I was doing that before I served in the legislature, I had no idea how really it impacted it. And frankly, I could never really quite put my finger on why so many people would show up so pissed off about what was going on, about a proposed zoning change. It's like, I was just really naive, and I'm not suggesting that people are ignorant. It's just they're not really aware of the implications that it is to say, hey, this is only industrial here. Okay, well, what does that mean for me? Like, it's difficult to kind of bring it down to that level.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I wrote that book, Key to the City, because I was a planning commissioner myself. It talks a lot about my service on the city of Hartford, Connecticut's Planning and Zoning Commission. We actually rewrote our entire zoning ordinance, overhauled it, threw it out in one night, voted in a completely new one that I think really spoke to the values of the community for more housing, more mixed use, more walkable communities, less reliance on the car. Even as a central city and a historic city, Hartford had seen a lot of car-oriented development that was hugely detrimental to our residents. So we just reversed all of that. And then I spent the next few years trying to, make sure that the code was implemented and tweaked as needed. And so the book talks a lot about that. But it's a great book, I think, for people who serve on planning and zoning commissions, because it does put all the pieces together through stories. I'm a data person, I'm a visual person, but I know that people who really some people really gravitate towards stories, and that's actually, if I had to pick an audience of, who of all these lawyers or developers or real estate agents should read this book, I would say commissioners, because the commissioners are the ones that make the rules, and often, like you did, well-meaning, you're there to serve, but not necessarily having that context means that probably you lost some opportunities to make some really important changes that you could have
Totally.
made. And it,
I was
again,
just
no
having
fault
this
of your own.
Yeah, I was just having this conversation with somebody yesterday who went to the planning board to change their public road in the subdivision that was approved to a private road, because they started out and they're like, this is just economically not going to work for this market, and we need to change it to a private road. Well, in Maine, and probably in other states, there is a state level road maintenance agreement for private roads, meaning that if the residents of that road don't put together a road maintenance agreement about who's going to plow it, maintain it, and everything, then the state says, well, it's divided among the number of people that are on the road. And so if there's like 10 owners on the road, then it's divided by 10. And it's just the way it is. It's a state law. Well, the local planning board was like, well, you need to have a road maintenance agreement. And this applicant was like, we already have one. It's default by the state. And they're like, well, you need to have your own. And then he was like, okay, what do you want me to have in it? And they gave him things that were like not as good as what the state level was in terms of being, like simple to understand and implement, and really kind of worse for the city than the one that the state had, because that there was one member of the planning board who just couldn't wrap their head around the fact that the state has already addressed this issue. It was largely actually driven by real estate agents who were trying to transact properties, and the bank would say, "Where's the RMA?" And they were like, "There isn't one." And then one of the residents was a holdout, and it would blow up the sale of the home because they didn't have a road maintenance agreement in place. So we just put one for the whole entire state. My point in sharing this is, at the end of this conversation, he said to me, "I really think that all planning board members should either be like some kind of a paid position, which would never happen, or that they get some kind of formal training, around what to do." Because in the United States, private property rights are some of the most coveted rights that we have. And many people have private property, but many people don't. And Jamestown was an interesting settlement, and it almost failed because the government owned all of it to start. And then we gave private property rights to people, and whoa, look what happened. They thrived. And then people started spreading west with the Homestead Act from Lincoln, and they put down their stake, and they had pride of ownership and a skin in the game, right? And now we have people who are well-intentioned. I was on the planning board, but not trained when I was there. I was asked to serve, and I had a servant's heart. I want to be there, but didn't have the right tools, making decisions around impacting people's private property rights that are pretty significant. And it seems that if we don't get a hold of this, it's going to create an even larger chasm between the haves and have-nots, because we're not creating ways in which people can have a seat at the table. And I don't know if maybe this is just a problem here locally or if it's happening elsewhere. It sounds like it's a national phenomenon, not just a state level
Absolutely.
phenomenon. But it's really depressing, to be honest with you, because we're not giving people that opportunity that we claim that it's about the American dream, yet it's actually not achievable.
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the training issue. Without real training, we risk a lot for individual property owners, but also for our communities and people who are making decisions that have huge consequences without understanding what those consequences are. That's a problem for all of us. In Connecticut, that first batch of legislation that I mentioned passing in HB 6107 back in 2021 in response to some of the data we presented in the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, and in response to a wide-ranging coalition that took that data to the Connecticut legislature. One of the things in that bill that we pushed for and got adopted was a training requirement for local commissioners. Now, you might grumble and say, "Oh, well, a few hours a year, what does that do?" But first of all, it's better than nothing. And second of all, given the stakes, Connecticut, one of the slowest growing states in the nation, huge inequality, crazy home prices, developers and companies that can't expand because they don't have workers, because nobody can afford to live in Connecticut. It's an existential crisis for Connecticut, the lack of available and affordable housing. And so training, and is it like the bare minimum that we could ask from these of folks who, like myself, again, I was a commissioner for 7 years, bare minimum that we ask that everybody at least get some basics on what their decisions mean.
Yeah. Well, I wish we had more time, but I do want to wrap this up with something a little bit that people could hang their hat on, so to speak, in terms of what people who are listening that maybe aren't developers or policy wonks like you and I, what they could do to try and really affect change on this front, and also where they should turn to get more information about the National Zoning Atlas.
Great. And you did have that question earlier on, and I did not answer it. So I'm really glad you brought it up again. The what can people do question. I think just basically educating yourself about what zoning is and how it works in your community is a really great first step. Linking up with some groups that have made zoning front and center. And I would say a lot of the Yes in My Backyard housing groups, which actually have emerged from all kinds of political backgrounds and in all kinds of communities. Those often have good information about how you can be involved, whether it's attending a public hearing, providing information about your neighborhood to policymakers, verbalizing the fact that you want certain things out of your land use rules, whether it be more housing or less environmental destruction or less cars or whatever. Providing those pathways and how you can interact with your local policymakers is pretty important. As for the National Zoning Atlas, you can see it online at zoningatlas.org. In just a few weeks, we'll be launching the Preservation Atlas at preservationatlas.org, where you'll be able to see over time historic properties and the rules that apply to them. So stay tuned for that, because I know
We'll have to do session 2 on that, because we are sitting in a National Historic Register property in which I did a historic tax credit project on to revitalize it into office and housing. So maybe there'll be version 2 with you to dig into that.
Yes,
I didn't even know you were doing that.
Preservation Atlas is going to have a toggle for where can you get historic tax credits. So that it's going to be built for you.
I love it. That's so cool. And others who want to save this. And it's good for the environment to recycle
Absolutely.
These old buildings. Well, Sara, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate the insight into this. Zoning is not a boring topic. It's a very important topic, though sometimes difficult to articulate, I think, in ways that people can understand and really bring home to how it impacts them. But ultimately, what people should know, and I think you did such a wonderful job sharing, is that if they choose not to engage on discussions about zoning, they're choosing not to engage in part of the solution to adding the housing that we desperately need. So I really thank you for joining us here today, for all the great work you're doing. And hopefully we'll have a version 2 in the future to talk about the historic preservation.
Thanks.
Piece.
Maybe in person next time.
Yes, absolutely. That'd be wonderful.
Have a great one.
Thanks, Sara. Cheers. Bye.